He was a farmer, and the land demanded a quiet mind. Elian's world had shrunk to the size of his fields, the warmth of his forge, and the 4 stone walls of his house. It was a small kingdom, but it was orderly. The fences were mended, the tools were clean, the silence was a constant companion, a heavy blanket he had pulled over his life after the fever took his wife and daughter. Some days the silence was a comfort. Most days it was just heavy. His routine was a bulwark against memory. He woke before the sun, the cold floorboards a familiar shock to his bare feet. He stoked the embers in the hearth, his breath pluming in the chill air. He milked his goat, collected the single egg from his hen, and ate his breakfast of hard bread and cheese standing by the window, watching the grey light seep into the valley. Then came the work, ploughing, planting, weeding, harvesting, mending the things that time and weather conspired to break. It was a life measured in seasons and the slow turning of the earth, and it was enough, or so he told himself. His farm was the last patch of tamed land before the wilderness began. To the east lay the scattered holdings of other men, a day's walk away. To the west, the land grew wilder, rising into the jagged, tooth-like mountains of the Broken Tusk territories. Orc country. He kept his eyes on his own soil, paid his tithes, and troubled no one. In return, he was left alone. It was a fragile but functional peace. The storm came in from those mountains, a mass of bruised purple clouds that swallowed the afternoon sun. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, tearing at the thatch of his barn. Elian moved with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who knew the whims of the sky. He herded the goat and hen into the small, sturdy barn, latched the door, and checked the braces on the shutters of his house. The air grew thick and cold, carrying the smell of rain and wet stone. It was then he heard it, a sound that did not belong to the storm, a heavy, splintering crash from the edge of the woods that bordered his property. It was followed by a guttural cry of pain, quickly stifled. Every instinct, honed by years of solitude and caution, told him to go inside, bar the door, and feed the fire. The woods held dangers he had no wish to face, but the cry had sounded less like a beast's and more like something else, something desperate. He hesitated for a long moment, the wind whipping his tunic against his skin. He thought of the stories travellers told, of orc patrols and the brutal politics of their clans. He was one man, a farmer. His only weapons were the tools of his trade. He went back into the house, but not to hide. He lit a heavy lantern, its yellow light a small, brave flicker against the growing dark. From the wall by the door, he took down his pitchfork. It was not a spear, but its tines were long and sharp, forged by his own hand. It felt solid in his grip. Holding the lantern high, he walked toward the tree line, the wind trying to steal the light and his resolve. Rain began to fall, fat, cold drops that turned the path to black sludge. The sound had come from a thicket of ancient oaks that marked the edge of his land. He found her, collapsed at the base of the largest oak, as if the tree itself had finally blocked her flight. She was an orc, larger than any human woman he had ever seen, broad-shouldered and powerfully built even in repose. Her armor was a mix of crudely hammered iron plates and thick leather, scarred and dented, A brutal-looking axe lay inches from her outstretched hand. A dark stain was spreading across her left side, soaking the leather and a tattered green tunic beneath it. His hand tightened on the pitchfork. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. She was dying, but a dying wolf was still a wolf. Her head lifted at his approach. Her face was harsh, all sharp angles and a strong jaw framed by thick black braids. Tusks, smaller than a male's but still formidable, jutted from her lower lip. Her eyes, the colour of moss in deep shade, fixed on him. They were filled with pain, exhaustion, and a defiant fire that even her wounds could not quench. Then he saw the movement beneath her heavy cloak. A small face, pale green and tear-streaked, peered out. A child. An orc child, no older than his own daughter had been. The child's eyes were wide with terror, fixed not on him, but on the dark woods behind them. The woman's chest hitched with a ragged breath. Her voice was a low rasp, rough as grinding stone, but it was not a threat. It was a plea. "Don't send me back," she whispered, the words barely audible over the rising storm. "They'll hurt my daughter." The world seemed to stop. The wind, the rain, the fear in his own chest, it all receded, leaving only the woman's desperate gaze, the child's terrified face, and the ghost of a memory. A small hand in his, a fever-bright pair of eyes. He had been helpless then, utterly, devastatingly helpless. He looked at the wounded orc, at the child hiding in the folds of her cloak. He saw not a monster, but a mother. And in that moment, he made a choice that went against every sensible, self-preserving instinct he had cultivated for a decade. He lowered the pitchfork. "Can you walk?" he asked. His own voice sounded foreign to him. She tried to push herself up, a grimace of agony tightening her features. She collapsed back against the tree with a sharp intake of breath. No. He took a step closer. The child flinched. The woman's hand twitched toward her axe. He stopped. He set the pitchfork down, deliberately, where she could see it. He held up his empty hands. "The barn," he said, pointing with his chin toward the squat, dark shape of the building. "It's dry. It's warm." She watched him, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Trust was a currency she clearly did not possess. But the rain was falling harder now, cold and relentless. The child began to shiver. The woman's gaze flickered from him to her daughter, and her fierce defiance seemed to crumble just a little at the edges. He approached slowly, using her massive frame as a crutch to help her to her feet. The effort cost her. A low groan escaped her lips, and her weight was immense, a solid wall of muscle and bone. Leaning on him, stumbling, she half walked, half dragged herself across the muddy yard. The child trailed behind, a small, silent shadow clinging to her mother's cloak. The barn smelled of hay, goat, and damp earth. It was a comforting, familiar scent to him. He led them to an empty stall, deep with clean straw. He helped the orc woman ease herself down, her breathing coming in harsh, wet rasps. Once she was settled, she immediately pulled the child into her arms, creating a protective fortress around her. Her moss-green eyes followed his every move. He left and returned with a bucket of water from the well and a few clean linen cloths he tore from an old shirt. He set them down a careful distance away. "The wound needs cleaning," he said. Her response was a low growl. Her hand rested on the hilt of a long knife at her belt. The message was clear. "Lady, if I had tricks, I wouldn't live like this," he said, gesturing to the simple rustic barn. It was the driest humour, born of a grim reality. "The wound is foul. It will kill you if it's not tended. Then what happens to her?" He nodded toward the child, who was watching him with huge, unblinking eyes. That struck home. The iron wall of her suspicion cracked. After a long, tense silence, she gave a short, sharp nod. He knelt beside her. The air was thick with tension, a coiled spring ready to snap. He could feel the heat radiating from her body. Fever. Gently, he cut away the torn fabric of her tunic around the gash. The wound was deep, a vicious cut from a jagged blade by the look of it. It was inflamed and ugly, the edges already turning a sickly yellow. He worked in silence, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He washed the wound as best he could, her sharp hisses of pain the only sound besides the storm raging outside. She did not flinch or pull away. She endured it with a stillness that was more intimidating than any threat. It was the stillness of a predator, accustomed to pain. He knew a little of herbs. His wife had taught him. He had a small store of dried yarrow and comfrey in the house. He went to fetch them, half expecting to return and find them gone. But they were still there. The mother a silent statue, the child a wide-eyed owl. He made a poultice and applied it to the wound, then bound it tightly with the clean linen. Her muscles were like cords of wood beneath his fingers. He had never been this close to an orc before. Their skin was tough, a pale olive green. She smelled of pine needles, old leather, and blood. When he was done, he stood up, his knees aching. "You need to eat." He brought them a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, and a flask of water. He set it down and backed away, giving them space. The child, Kiri, he would later learn she was called, looked at the food with hungry eyes, but waited for her mother. The woman, Graka, inspected the food first, sniffing it cautiously before breaking off a piece of bread and handing it to her daughter. Only then did she eat a small piece herself, chewing slowly, her gaze never leaving him. He retreated to his house for the night. He did not barricade the door. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the look in the child's eyes. Perhaps it was the memory of his own helplessness. He sat in his chair by the cold hearth for a long time, listening to the storm and the unfamiliar presence in his barn, and wondered what kind of trouble he had just invited into his quiet, empty life. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and smelling of wet earth. He woke with a sense of unease, the events of the previous night feeling like a fever dream. But when he went outside, the barn door was slightly ajar. He found them awake. The child was asleep, curled into her mother's side. The woman, Graka, was sitting up, her back against the stall wall. The remains of the food were gone. The water bucket he had left, which had been half empty, was now full to the brim from the rain barrel outside. The cloths he had used were washed and laid out neatly to dry on a railing. It was a silent, practical message, a contribution, an acknowledgement. She looked haggard in the morning light, but the fire in her eyes was a little stronger. "The dressing needs to be changed," he said, keeping his voice even. She nodded, and this time there was no hesitation. She allowed him to tend to the wound again. It was still angry and red, but it looked cleaner. As he worked, he was aware of the child, who was now awake and watching him with a solemn curiosity. She had her mother's serious eyes. A strange, unspoken routine began to form over the next few days. He would work his fields, always conscious of the two sets of eyes watching him from the barn. He would bring them food, stew, bread, roasted vegetables. They would eat, and in return some small task would be done. The woodpile would be stacked more neatly. His dull axe would be sharpened to a razor's edge. The goat's pen would be mucked out. They were small things, gestures of reciprocity in a language that required no words. Graca was healing, her formidable constitution fighting off the infection. She moved with a stiff grace, the pain still evident in her movements, but she was never idle. She spent hours maintaining her gear, oiling the leather of her armor, sharpening her axe and knife until they gleamed. The child, Kiri, started to venture out of the barn. She would sit on the porch steps, a tiny, silent figure, and watch him work in the forge. One afternoon, he was hammering a new hinge for his gate. The rhythmic clang of hammer on steel was a familiar comfort. He glanced over and saw Kiri watching, her head tilted. On a whim, he took a small piece of scrap iron, heated it in the coals, and hammered it into a crude shape, a small, lopsided horse. He quenched it in the water trough and handed it to her. She looked at the warm metal in her small hand, then up at him. For the first time, a tiny smile touched her lips. She didn't say anything, just clutched the iron horse and ran back to the barn to show her mother. He saw Graca look from the toy to him, her expression unreadable. That night, the fever finally took hold of her. He was woken by a frantic tugging on his sleeve. He opened his eyes to see Kiri standing by his bed, her face pale in the moonlight streaming through the window. Tears were silently tracking down her cheeks. She pulled him again, her small hand surprisingly strong, and led him out to the barn. Graca was thrashing in the straw, muttering in her harsh, guttural tongue. Her skin was slick with sweat, and she burned with a frightening heat. Her eyes were open but saw nothing. The infection had rallied for one last, desperate assault. For the next 2 days, the farm and the fields were forgotten. His world shrank to the dim light of the barn and the fight for Graca's life. He brewed endless cups of willow bark tea, forcing the bitter liquid between her cracked lips. He and Kiri worked together, fetching cool water from the well to bathe her forehead. The child was tireless, her small face a mask of grim determination. She seemed to have transferred her absolute trust in her mother to him. During the long, quiet hours of the second night, he dozed in a chair he'd dragged into the barn. The air was cold. He woke with a start, feeling a weight on his shoulders. Kiri had draped his own heavy wool cloak over him. She was sitting on a stool nearby, watching her mother, her little iron horse clutched in her hand. It was a gesture of such profound, simple kindness that it lodged somewhere deep in his chest, a warm and painful thing. On the third day, the fever broke. Graca woke, weak and drenched in sweat, but lucid. Her eyes found him sitting by her side. She looked at him, then at Kiri asleep beside him, then at the cloak draped over his chair. She said nothing, but something had shifted between them. The sharp edges of her mistrust had been worn smooth by shared crisis and quiet care. As she regained her strength, a fragile peace settled over the farm. They began to share the evening meal, not as keeper and prisoners, but as a household. They still rarely spoke, but the silences were no longer heavy with suspicion. They were comfortable, filled with the small sounds of living, the crackle of the fire, the clink of spoons against wooden bowls. One evening, they sat by the forge fire. He was mending a leather strap on his boot. Kiri was tracing patterns in the dust with a stick. She pointed to a small, weathered object on a high shelf. A wooden bird, its paint faded. "What's that?" she asked. Her voice was small but clear. Elian's hands stilled. He hadn't looked at that bird in years. "I carved it," he said, his voice thick. "For my daughter." "Where is she?" Kiri asked, with the innocent cruelty of a child. He looked into the fire, the flames blurring. "She's gone. Her and her mother. A fever, a long time ago." He hadn't said those words aloud to another soul. They felt like stones in his mouth. He dared a glance at Graca. She was watching him, her expression somber. He expected pity or perhaps dismissal of human weakness. Instead, she just held his gaze for a moment, a flicker of shared understanding in her dark eyes. Later that night, after Kiri was asleep in the barn, Graca found him by the fence, looking up at the stars. "He was a warrior," she said, her voice low. She didn't need to explain who she meant. "My mate, Kiri's father. He was killed by my cousin's blades." It was an offering, a story for a story. "My cousin, Gorak," she continued, the name spat out like poison. "He wants the clan. Our ways are old. He says they are weak. He says I am weak because my mate was from a lesser bloodline. He says Kiri is an impurity." Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "He killed his own uncle, my father, in the challenge ring. But he cheated, a poisoned blade. No one would stand with me. They were too afraid." She spoke of betrayal, of a home stolen, of running for weeks through the wilderness with Gorak's hunters on her trail. She didn't tell him her title or the name of her clan, but he understood now that she was more than just a refugee. She was carrying the weight of a legacy. He had invited a storm into his quiet life, and he was beginning to realize he was standing directly in its path. The first sign of trouble came a week later. He was checking his snares at the edge of the woods when he found them. Tracks. Not the familiar prints of deer or his own worn boots. These were large, heavy, and shod in iron. Orcs. A patrol. His blood ran cold. He followed the tracks at a distance. They circled his property, a clear, deliberate reconnaissance. Then he saw it, carved deep into the wood of a fence post. A symbol. A tusk broken in the middle, with a spear driven through it. It was a claim, a threat. They knew. He ran back to the farm, his heart pounding. He found Graka by the barn, splitting firewood with his axe. She handled the heavy tool with an easy, terrifying grace. He pointed wordlessly back toward the woods. Tracks, he managed to say, a symbol on the fence. Her face became a mask of stone. She looked at the axe in her hands, then at the barn where Kiri was playing. How many? I don't know. The tracks were a few hours old. They'll send scouts first, she said, her voice flat and hard, to test the defences. He looked around at his small, peaceful farm. A low stone wall, a wooden fence, a house with glass windows. What defences? Her gaze was grim. You and I. They came 2 days later in the dust of late afternoon. 3 of them. They were large males, clad in the same piecemeal armour as Graka, but theirs was adorned with the broken tusk symbol. They swaggered across his field as if they owned it, their arrogance a palpable force. Elian met them at the gate, his pitchfork held loosely in his hands. He tried to look like a simple, terrified farmer. It wasn't difficult. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The leader, a brute with a scarred face and a cruel smile, sneered at him. "We're looking for something, little man. A stray bitch and her pup. Seen anything like that?" "I see no one out here," Elian said. "I keep to myself." "Is that so?" The orc pushed the gate open, sending it swinging back into Elian. "We'll just have a look around, to be sure." He tried to block their path to the barn. "That's my private property." The orc laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He shoved Elian hard, sending him stumbling back into the dirt. "Your property belongs to whoever is strong enough to take it, human." As the orcs moved toward the barn, the door creaked open. Graka stood there. She had donned her scarred armour. Her massive axe was held in a 2-handed grip, its polished edge gleaming in the sunlight. She was not fully healed, he knew that. She still moved with a hint of stiffness, but she stood like a mountain in the doorway, an immovable object of pure menace. The scouts stopped dead. Their arrogant smirks vanished, replaced by shock, and then a flicker of fear. They knew who she was. "You are far from home, dogs of Gorak." Graka's voice was low, a rumbling threat. It was not the voice of a refugee. It was the voice of a commander. The lead scout recovered his bluster. "Gorak sends his regards, traitor. He wants his property back. The child. Give her to us, and we'll let the human live." Graka's only reply was to take 1 step forward, settling into a warrior's stance. The fight was short and brutal. The scouts charged. Graka met the first one, her axe swinging in a devastating arc that sheared through his shield and deep into his shoulder. As the second one tried to flank her, Elian reacted on pure instinct. He scrambled to his feet, grabbed his pitchfork, and jammed it between the orc's legs. The warrior roared in surprise and pitched forward into a muddy ditch used for irrigation. Elian's action gave Graka the second she needed. She spun, her axe a blur of motion, and buried it in the third orc's chest. The second one was struggling to get out of the ditch, sputtering curses. Graka walked over, pulled her axe free from the dead orc, and ended the fight with a single, efficient blow. Silence descended. broken only by the buzzing of flies and Elian's own ragged breathing. 2 orcs lay dead in his yard. His peaceful farm had become a battlefield. Graca leaned on her axe, her chest heaving. She looked at him, then at the dead orcs. "They won't send scouts next time," she said, her voice grim. "He'll come himself." The peace was not just shattered, it was annihilated. They dragged the bodies into the woods, a grim task that left a dark trail in the grass. They had bought themselves time, a day, maybe 2. As they were working, barricading the windows of the house and reinforcing the barn door, another figure appeared on the horizon. This one was alone, moving with a purpose that spoke of long travel. It was an orc, female, older than Graca, her face a road map of old scars. She carried a spear and a small pack. Graca saw her and straightened, her hand going to her axe. The newcomer stopped at a respectful distance and stared at Graca for a long moment. Then, to Elian's astonishment, the scarred warrior dropped to one knee and bowed her head. "My chieftain," the warrior said, her voice rough with emotion. "I thought we had lost you." Chieftain. The word hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. Elian looked from the kneeling warrior to Graca, and suddenly all the pieces clicked into place. The authority in her voice, the way she fought, the reason she was being hunted so relentlessly. The loyalist warrior, whose name was Urca, told the rest of the story. Graca was not just some noble's daughter. She was Graca Bloodaxe, daughter of the old chieftain, the rightful heir to the entire Broken Tusk clan. Kiri was her designated successor, the future of their line. Gorak's betrayal was not just a family squabble, it was a coup, a violent seizure of power that had left the clan fractured and bleeding. Urca and a handful of others had been searching for her since she fled. Elian felt a cold chasm open up between himself and the woman he had been sheltering. He had been tending to the wounds of a fugitive, a mother protecting her child. Now he found he was harboring royalty in exile. A queen. A profound sense of betrayal, sharp and bitter, washed over him. He felt small, insignificant. A pawn in a deadly political game he couldn't begin to understand. He had shared his home, his food, the story of his own grief. Had she been laughing at him? The simple human farmer so easily duped. Their quiet moments, the shared meals, the silent understanding. It all felt like a lie now, a calculated manipulation to secure a safe haven. "You should have told me," he said, his voice flat. He couldn't look at her. He stared at the hammer in his hand, his knuckles white. Graca's expression was hard to read. There was no apology in it, but something else. Regret, perhaps. "You would not have helped a chieftain," she stated. It wasn't a question. "You don't know that," he shot back, though in his heart he knew she was probably right. The scale of it would have terrified him. It still did. "I know you're kind," she said, her voice softer than he expected. "You want peace, quiet. My life has not been quiet for a long time." She looked at Kiri, who was watching them with worried eyes. "I did what I had to do to protect my daughter. If that meant being only a mother, and not a chieftain, then that is what I was. Before he could answer, Urka, who had been scanning the horizon, gave a sharp cry. "They come!" He looked. On the ridge to the west, a dark line of figures had appeared. Not 3, dozens. A war band. Banners bearing the broken tusk symbol snapped in the wind. At their head was a massive orc in black iron armor, a horned helmet on his head. Gorak. There was no more time for anger or betrayal. The storm had arrived. They retreated into the farmhouse, the strongest building. Urka, a veteran of countless battles, took command of their meager defenses. They had 3 fighters, Graka, Urka, and Elian, who was armed with his pitchfork and a heavy smithing hammer. The warband surrounded the house. Gorak himself strode forward, his footsteps heavy on the earth Elian had tilled for so long. "Graka," his voice boomed, a sound of raw power and malice. "Your hiding is over. Come out and face your new chieftain."
"Give me the child, and I will grant you a swift death. Refuse, and I will burn this farm to the ground with you and your human pet inside it." Elian's world, his quiet, orderly kingdom, was about to be turned to ash. He looked at the window barricades he had just built, at the home he had made. A cold, hard rage began to smoulder beneath his fear. This was his land, his home. The siege began. Fire arrows thudded into the roof and walls. The dry wood of the barn, his forge, caught fire first, flames licking up into the sky, consuming his life's work. Smoke filled the air. The sound was deafening, the roar of flames, the splintering of wood, the war cries of the orcs. They fought from the windows, Urka with a short bow, Graka with throwing axes she had carried in her pack. Elian used his pitchfork to repel orcs who tried to climb the walls. It was a desperate, hopeless defense. They were hopelessly outnumbered. During a brief lull, as the attackers prepared a battering ram, Gorak's mocking voice rose again. "Look at you, my cousin, hiding behind a farmer. Has the blood axe line fallen so low? He cannot protect you. He is nothing, a worm in the dirt I am about to claim." Graka stood up, visible in the doorway of the burning house. The firelight cast flickering shadows on her face, making her look like a goddess of war. But she did not look at Gorak. She looked at Elian. He was standing near the hearth, his face grimed with soot, his knuckles bleeding, the smithing hammer held tight in his hand. He was terrified, out of his depth, a farmer pretending to be a soldier. Her voice cut through the chaos, clear and strong as forged steel. It was a formal declaration, meant for all to hear. Her enemy, her ally, and the man at the center of it all. "This man is not my shield," she proclaimed, her voice ringing with an authority he had never heard before. "He is Elian of the hearth." He opened his door to the hunted. He mended the broken. He protected the blood of my line when all others had fled. By the old laws, by the right of iron and fire, I name him Hearthkin. He has a place by my side. His house is my house, and my clan is his clan. Elian stared at her, stunned into silence. It was not a promise of protection. It was an offer of alliance. A public, political, and deeply personal declaration that bound him to her fate in front of the very man who wanted them both dead. It was a defiant act of choosing worth over station, kindness over brutality. Gorak roared with laughter. Hearthkin, you would bind yourself to a human. You defile your bloodline. I will kill him first and make you watch. The assault resumed with a new fury. The battering ram slammed against the door, the old wood groaning in protest. The end was coming. In the heart of that chaos, Elian found a strange clarity. His anger, his sense of betrayal, it all burned away in the heat of the fire, leaving something pure and hard behind. He was no chieftain, he was no warrior, but he was a man who had been offered a place. He had been seen. He moved to stand beside Graka at the splintering door. "I accept," he said, his voice quiet but firm amidst the din. "But not as your dependent, not as someone you protect." He met her gaze, his own eyes reflecting the flames. "I will stand with you, as I am, a farmer, a smith, or I will not stand at all." A grim smile touched her lips. It was a fearsome, beautiful thing. "Then stand, Elian of the Hearth." The door burst inwards. They couldn't win, they knew that, but Urka had planned for it. "The root cellar," she yelled over the roar. "There's a tunnel for winter stores. It comes out by the creek." They fought a desperate, retreating battle through the burning shell of Elian's home. He swung his hammer not with skill, but with the raw strength of a man who had spent his life working with his hands. He fought to protect the path for Urka, who was carrying a terrified but silent Kiri. Graka was a whirlwind of destruction at his side, her axe clearing a path. They scrambled down into the darkness of the cellar, pulling the heavy stone slab over the entrance just as the burning roof collapsed above them. They fled through the narrow, damp tunnel, the sounds of the battle and the destruction of his world fading behind them. They emerged into the cool night air by the creek, choking on smoke and grief. Elian looked back. His farm, his entire life, was a pillar of fire against the night sky. Everything he had built, everything he had owned, was gone, turned to ash. He had nothing left, except the 3 fugitives standing beside him in the mud. A deposed chieftain, a scarred veteran, and a small child who clutched a little iron horse in her hand. He had lost his home, but in its place he had been given a purpose. They travelled for weeks, moving by night, hiding by day. Urka led them through hidden paths and forgotten trails, deeper into the wilderness. They met up with other loyalists, a handful at a time. A grizzled old warrior here, a family of hunters there. Orcs who had refused to bow to Gorak, who still believed in the old ways. To them, Elian was an anomaly, a human, an outsider. They looked at him with suspicion, some with open hostility. They saw him as a weakness, a liability. He did not try to prove them wrong by picking up a sword. He did not pretend to be one of them. He did what he knew. When an axle in their cart broke, he built a makeshift forge and mended it. When armor straps frayed, he stitched them with leather he cured himself. When their knives grew dull, he sharpened them on river stones until they could shave hair. He showed them which roots were safe to eat, how to build a smokeless fire, how to track game without leaving a trail of his own. He cared for Kiri, telling her stories of the seasons and carving her a whole family of wooden animals to keep her iron horse company. He was not a warrior. He was a builder, a mender, a smith.
His strength was not in breaking things, but in making them whole again. And slowly, grudgingly, the orcs of Gracha's fledgling clan began to see his worth. They started coming to him not with suspicion, but with requests. "The haft on my spear is split, smith." "My child has a fever, farmer. What herbs are good for it?" He earned their respect not with a blade, but with his calloused, capable hands. Months passed. They found a hidden valley, well defended and with fresh water, and began to build a new settlement. It was not a farm, it was a fortress, but it was a home. Gracha was no longer a fugitive, but a leader, her war band growing as word of her survival spread. The war with Gorak was far from over, but here, in this valley, they had a foothold. They had hope. One morning, Gracha prepared to lead a raid, a daring strike against one of Gorak's supply lines. She stood in the center of the new Great Hall, a building of raw timber that still smelled of fresh cut pine, and Elian moved around her, checking the buckles and straps of her armor. The task had become a ritual, a quiet moment of intimacy before the violence. His hands, familiar with the geography of her armor, moved with practiced ease. There was no tension now, no fear, just a comfortable, grounding silence. As he tightened the last strap on her pauldron, her hand came up and rested on his for a moment. Her skin was warm and calloused against his. He looked up and met her gaze. Her moss-green eyes held a depth of feeling she would never speak aloud. Gratitude, respect, partnership. He nodded, then stepped back. He looked across the hall, where Kiri was practicing with a wooden sword he had carved for her, her movements a clumsy but fierce imitation of her mother's. Urka was instructing her, a rare smile on her scarred face. He had lost a family to the whims of fate and had walled himself off from the world to nurse the wound. He had believed that a small, quiet life was all he had left. Now, impossibly, he had found another family, forged in fire and desperation. He was no longer Elian the farmer, hiding from the ghosts of his past. He was Elian of the hearth, the chieftain's kin, a man who had been offered a choice in the dark and had chosen to stand. He had learned that true strength was not only in the arm that wielded the axe. It was in the steady hands that mended the shield, the quiet knowledge that fed the hungry, and the heart that, against all reason, chose to protect a stranger's child in a storm. And that, he knew, was a kind of strength that could rebuild a world.